Norman Solomon, author of a new book called The Power of Babble, The Politician's Dictionary of Buzzwords, Double Talk for Every Occasion. As an observer of political speech, how do you judge the ability of the two presidential candidates, George Bush and Bill Clinton, in using language to achieve each of their political goals? First, George Bush.
Well, he's very good. He has adept speechwriters like Peggy Noonan. The words are calculated, they're crisp, there's a rhythm to them. We can remember 4 years later about 1,000 points of light. And these are words that really stick with us. So I think he's got his rhetoric down, although there are limits to what rhetoric can do when you're sinking.
Bill Clinton.
He's really developed, I think, a genre of rhetoric that places him in the so-called center. And I think we saw in New York at the Democratic Convention how that positioning involves some traditional buzzwords and elevates some new ones like responsibility, responsible behavior. And there's some problems with that, but certainly it's adept in terms of winning votes in the short run.
Do you distinguish between the formal prepared texts, such as an inaugural address in your book and in your discussion and in your study, and then the stump speeches?
Well, there are off-the-cuff speeches that are more, of course, informal and so forth, but in a sense, I'm not sure that there are any major addresses or even appearances by an ideal candidate, according to the handlers, where someone would wander off and improvise. I mean, that's considered dangerous. If you think while you're talking in advance, then your thinking may cause you some problems. In other words, one of the goals of political language and the manipulation of words by politicians is to preempt and precede thought by the voters. They're trying to interfere generally with a precision so that instead of understanding what a politician stands for or what the constituents are who is paying the politician, there's a vague haze. And in that sense, a politician is usually trying to be very ambiguous even while also attempting to sound very forthright.
We should tell the audience that the book which we just showed you is out brand new. It's in paperback. There's no hardback version. And it is truly, it's in a dictionary format with phrases in alphabetical order. And we'll go through a few, give you an idea of what's in here. But I have to ask you, why did you think this book had to be written?
Even with all of the commercials and the slick productions and image making, I think words are still the staple of the political diet. That's what's fed to us or force-fed to us. And unless we can, in a sense, develop our personal and social radar screens to detect unidentified flying buzzwords, you might say, then we're going to continue to be victimized by this double talk. And so the words, in a sense, the hot air has to be deconstructed as it rises from the teleprompters, as it comes across the airwaves. Unless we can discern what the hidden agendas are behind the buzzwords, we're in big trouble, which I think is a good description of the political landscape right now.
We want to give the audience a few examples of what we're talking about before we go to the phones, and we will, but in the meantime, we put the numbers up on the screen. You can begin dialing now. There's a little bit of space available for you to get in, and the subject is political speech, and that's a big subject, so it'd be interesting to see what people think about not only the speeches they're hearing now, but what they've heard over their political lives and whether there's been an evolution. We might get to that. But in the introduction, you offer some samples, and I must say, wouldn't you characterize this as a little bit tongue-in-cheek?
Well, it's a condensation. Usually we get these kind of buzzwords diluted and we don't recognize how absurd they are and how they don't really say anything except often pander to prejudices.
Let me give people something to work with, and then you can talk about it. And this is, I guess, a buzzword-laden speech. You describe it as a combative statement given by politician X. America bashing and anti-Western appeasement may appeal to atheists, but such backroom bankruptcy is barbaric bean counting inside the Beltway, where Big Brother is big government with a blank check. Boys on the bus don't seem to mind the breakdown of the family. With the brie and white wine set and their burdensome budgets, a bureaucracy of cheap shot class conflict is fueling costly cradle-to-grave criminality. The demagoguery is divisive. Doom and gloom feds promote a feeding frenzy aided by flim-flammers, flip-flops, herd journalists, ideologues, and influence peddlers, and you go on. What is a boy on the bus?
Well, that's jargon for politicians who, or or used by politicians to describe journalists who are covering their campaigns, it's usually derisive.
Where did you get all of this?
Well, I really just read speeches. I spent a lot of last year gnashing my teeth, reading thousands of speeches by politicians past and present. I can't say I was looking forward to the '92 campaign, but I knew it would come around just like the calendar, and I felt that we needed to be able to, in a sense, forearm ourselves, be aware of what would come at us in large quantities, as indeed it has this year. That is a little sample speech, a little soundbite that is alphabetized for easy reference, and it just draws on many of the buzz phrases in here. When you hear that, there's a rhythm, there's a momentum to it, and you're encouraged to forget that there are lives in the balance every time the government acts or does not act on an issue. And right now we have a tremendous amount of suffering in this country because of the economy, because of unequal opportunity, and yet this is the kind of babbling that we get on a routine basis.
Do you think that the word, well, obviously you do, but some people wonder if words even matter? It's the ideas that matter.
Well, words matter tremendously. Before a politician is able to, as an office holder, implement policies that will cause the deaths of people in Iraq or in South Central Los Angeles or in rural areas of this country where poverty is still very severe, language has to be, in a sense, damaged or even killed. And when language becomes hollow, then all kinds of atrocities become possible. We saw that a couple of years ago in the lead up to the Gulf War. We're seeing it now to some extent with the war drums being beat on the front pages and the primetime news in terms of a supposed renewed threat from Iraq. Of course, there is no such renewed threat. There is a non-proliferation problem in Iraq and around the world, including in the United States, where nuclear tests continue despite the provisions of that treaty. So that's one example of how language, for instance, in the book The Rule of Law, which is a big phrase that George Bush has used, the rule of law. That's when those who made the rules lay down the law. And it's significant that George Bush invoked that phrase, as did Dan Quayle, in the lead up to the Gulf War, and also invoked it when Los Angeles was burning 2 or 3 months ago. But when people do not have an even-handed application of the law or even participation in forming it, then it's kind of hollow for them to be scolded by those in power who claim that the rule of law has to be upheld. Of course, it's simply rhetoric that covers an unequal application of the law, and in that sense we have an unjust use of language, and that is kind of the mechanism for, you might say, a propaganda system that allows these kind of policies to continue.
Quickly before this first phone call, who then among those politicians or office holders that we would recognize would you cite as an example who makes just use of language as opposed to the unjust use you just talked about?
It's very tough to find politicians who don't engage in rhetoric. Generally, when you are lower down in the hierarchy, when you're not in a power position that has required so many accommodations to big dollar funders, you can find people who are more plain speaking. For instance, when I hear a speech by Ron Dellums on the floor of the House, I have a feeling that he's in touch with people's pain and people's suffering. He doesn't simply pull out of his computer an aggregation of buzzwords and then throw it at people. But that's an exception, and of course there's kind of a glass ceiling when people talk straight, when they talk about inequity in the society and name names and name corporations that are enforcing that inequity. They're not going to rise to the presidential level, to put it mildly.
New Brunswick, New Jersey is first up. Go ahead, please. New Brunswick, New Jersey, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm very interested in what you think of Bill Clinton's new covenant, whether you see that as a philosophically consistent articulation of a new democratic philosophy, and what sort of rhetorical air pockets you might see in that.
Yeah. Well, part of the New Covenant idea is certainly a religious overtone that is useful given the kind of constituency that he's trying to build, or the combination of constituencies. But there's also the undertone of a social contract that he's trying to make or remake between the government and the American people. And the rhetoric of the New Covenant, I think, goes hand in hand with rhetoric that Clinton and Al Gore and the Democratic Leadership Council has been trying to implement for a long time. And if we look at their language about the need for responsible behavior, you know, responsibility is a big thing in Bill Clinton's rhetoric. And when I was in Madison Square Garden during the convention in New York, of course, that was in the air a lot with Clinton and other speakers. But the problem with the responsibility rhetoric, and I certainly have a lot of mention of responsibility in the book, the problem is that you have an unequal application of that demand. You've got a record of Bill Clinton saying that people on welfare should behave responsibly, people who are getting public assistance of various types owe the government in that social contract responsible behavior as kind of a quid pro quo, but there's not that kind of preaching that goes on towards the large corporations that, for instance, have continued to foul the waterways of the state of Arkansas. So it's a very unequal application of the term.
Before the next call, I want to continue throughout the rest of the time to give people a sample of what's in here, and I'll just read. Here's one entry picked at random. Hardball politics, a figure of speech that can make complaints about political chicanery seem like they're coming from naive persons with overly thin cowhide. It was just good old hardball American politics, is the usage cited from the Virginia Republican Legislative Caucus in 1991. Houston, Texas, next. Go ahead.
Yes. Do you, two questions. One, do you see such groups as the Anti-Defamation League and the NAACP performing a valuable service in kind of demystifying and identifying divisive code words? And two, on a historical note, who do you see in recent presidential history as the best improvisational speaker? Thank you.
Well, in terms of divisive code words, I think that divisive can cut both ways. As I recall, divisive is in the book, unless we cut it out of the galleys. I think it's there. People are accused of being divisive quite often when they raise important questions. And I think when power is talked about, when the inequities between rich and poor are talked about, then often they are accused of divisiveness, or in the case of economics, encouraging class conflict. Of course, politicians, when they are funded by large corporate donors, don't hesitate to engage, in a sense, class warfare from the top down in terms of the tax policies that they favor. But there is a big prejudice in politician language against seeming to advocate for poor people to get more of a piece of the pie. So that divisive issue, I think, cuts both ways, because there are ways in which we have to talk about how interests are really conflicting. On the other question about how people speak off the cuff, I think...
who, in your judgment, is the best contemporaneous speaker?
Well, frankly, I think Clinton is quite good at it, and that's one of the reasons he's endeared himself. The comparison with John Kennedy is being made, and of course Kennedy was great at that. He also had terrific speechwriters. Of course, the realities of his policies were something else, but we were often Camelot, while a lot of things were going on in terms of counterinsurgency around the world that couldn't stand the light of day in terms of an acute look at what was happening. But that comparison between Clinton and Kennedy is being encouraged, I think, in a very conscious way by the Clinton campaign.
Divisive is not in the book. However, device is, and you define it as a tidy euphemism for a U.S. nuclear bomb. Next call, Long Beach, California. Go ahead. Long Beach, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. I'd like to congratulate C-SPAN on its usual excellent work.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask the guest on two buzzwords that I hear often. One, if he covers it in his book, one is the terminology American people and family values. The first one, American people, to me it has different implications. I think that politicians use it a lot in a deceptive kind of a way to say, well, the American people think this, or the American people do not think this, or are for this or for that. And to me, I personally find it insulting when they're, somebody else is speaking for me. And number two, I like to know if he defines, if family values are defined in his book as maybe gay bashing, or just like family extended bashing. Thank you very much.
Actually, the American people and family values are both in the book. I define the American people as a catch-all way to generalize about the attitudes, interests, and qualities of an entire population. And then the usage is they should be depicted as good-spirited, perceptive, and blameless. Also, and I think the caller's quite right, it's a way to generalize about how people are, or feel, or think, which is usually inaccurate. It's very broad brush. As for values, I have 8 different forms of values in the book.
Page
from
92.
Yeah. Well, we have American values and then on down to Western values. It's listed under values, comma, American, and on. And family values, of course, is in there. I define it in the book as being the positive values instilled by families, but not the negative ones. And I go on to say that in the usage of family values, since the values that actually hold sway in families vary a great deal, politicians will probably want to use family as a hazy adjective denoting goodness. I think the caller also alludes to a very key point, and that is that the use of the family values rhetoric by the bush quail people, and quail in particular, has been implicitly an attack not only on gays and lesbians who are part of varying family units of equal validity compared to any other, but also an attack on women who are taking different roles. And it's a not so subtle appeal to those who are threatened by egalitarian movements of the last few decades.
Leesville, Louisiana is next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air. I think.
The author's comments on corporate babble in particular. You know, I work for a very large corporation, and a lot of the paperwork and memorandums that come around are very, I think, not quite deceptive, but I think they don't want us to know everything that's going on, you know. And I'd just like to hear more about that. I haven't read your book. And also, I'd like to thank C-SPAN for their wonderful service.
Thank you. By the way, it's just out, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just come out in the last few weeks. It's in most bookstores.
Okay.
Well, I think the point about corporate role in government is very key. For instance, one of the big buzzwords this year is big government, and it's become very bipartisan. It's in the platform of the Democrats that they're against big government. Well, that's a pejorative that's aimed to put down agencies that help poor and lower middle income people, and also it's a term that is used to attack regulatory agencies at the federal and state and local level that provide a modicum of regulation of corporations. It's notable that the big government tag is not applied to an agency like the Pentagon that spends $300 billion a year and also has huge lucrative boondoggle contracts for many corporations who are making a killing figuratively, and in the case of the Gulf War, literally, in order to make profits.
You define lobbyists here. If you refer to lobbyists in public, you should do so with some evident distaste. The lobbyists who arrange matters such as contributions to your campaigns will understand that some postured distance is in order and mutually advantageous. What they want is your cooperation, not public embraces. Next call, New York City. Go ahead, please. New York City, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. I wanted to take issue with something Mr. Solomon said a moment ago about Governor Clinton's New Covenant speech and the idea of the New Covenant. I know that he has, in that idea, called for greater responsibility on the part of welfare recipients. But it's also been my understanding, and in fact I think I've seen it broadcast on C-SPAN, where Governor Clinton has spoken in front of a variety of business groups and also asked for certain sacrifices on their part. For instance, those executive salaries that are over $1 million that I think at the moment receive tax cuts would no longer receive tax cuts. The same would go for those companies that close their American plants and open overseas in countries where labor is much cheaper. So it seems to me that he has asked for sacrifices on the part of a variety of sectors and people and corporations in particular. Mm-hmm. So I'd be interested in your comment.
Yeah, thank you. Part of the problem is the tone and the repetition. I read many speeches by Clinton in the last year, and there's a boilerplate theme that comes around again and again, which is that the society is tired of people on welfare continually engaging in behavior that the society doesn't approve of, and so continued provision of aid for poor people will have to be contingent on certain behavior coming back from them in response. Of course, the fact that poor people have always been up against unequal opportunity and that there's nothing really in the program to change that terrain through which they are forced to walk, that isn't emphasized. Or even mentioned quite often. In terms of the corporations, there are some perhaps fairly token measures being proposed by Clinton, but I don't detect in his rhetoric that sermonizing, preaching tone that makes it an imperative that we bring corporations to heel in terms of their tremendous power over government policy making. Now, let me make clear, lest I be understood or misunderstood, I think that Bill Clinton is a better potential president than what we've gotten for the last 12 years, but that doesn't mean we should suspend our critical faculties. We need to be clear about what he is, who he's responsible to, and it's not the so-called middle class, it's the corporations that dump millions of dollars every year into the Democratic Leadership Council.
Here's an interesting entry. Iron Curtain. The entirety of the entry reads as follows. Obsolete. Are there other obsolete terms in here?
There are a few. Of course, the Cold War is increasingly obsolete as a buzz phrase, but of course, new rhetoric is being resurrected in a sense. The New World Order, in a sense, is a new way of giving orders to the world, even though it's very much like the old way of giving orders. So I think the need for an enemy is constant, even though the particular labels may shift from time to time.
Playa del Rey, California next.
Mr. Solomon, two questions. One dealing with your book, the second dealing with you. Regarding your book, do you think that possibly this babble of which you speak, that I tend to concur with, is what Ross Perot faced, and once facing it said, if that's the talk, then I don't want to walk the talk, and in effect, I don't want to buy into the program. Second question is, I hope you don't mind a personal question, what institutions do you hold degrees from? What degrees are they? Have you ever been married or divorced, and have you ever been a member of the military services?
Well, taking the second one first, I'm a journalist. I have been working as a journalist for 20 years, and my degrees are not formal ones. They're as an independent reporter. I've written for the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times as an independent writer of political analysis. So I hope that responds to the question. No, I have not ever been married. I have never been in the military. I've never been called. If I had been called during the Vietnam War, I definitely would not have gone to kill people for the U.S. government's policies in that part of the world. As for the other question about Ross Perot, I think that while many people who supported him were very sincere and were looking for straight talk, Ross Perot had a very different orientation. I've written critically in my syndicated column with Jeff Cohen that appears in the Seattle Times and San Francisco Examiner and elsewhere on a weekly basis. I've written critically about Ross Perot well before he reached his decline in the last couple of weeks. And I think that Perot had a very good facade of having no facade. But when you scratch the surface of his just folks talk about taking out the garbage and cleaning out the barn, he was someone who engaged in a lot of the same rhetoric that actually is in my book. He talked about, for instance, one out of many examples, the need for sacrifice. And this is something that Ronald Reagan talked about 10 years ago, about how the American people needed to sacrifice. And I find that rhetoric again and again in political speech. When a billionaire or even a millionaire tells me that I've got to get ready to sacrifice, I get nervous, and it's useful to, I think, look in the book and see a quote from Ronald Reagan from 10 years ago when he urged us to get ready to sacrifice. That was a lot of looted S&Ls ago, and it was a lot of tax breaks for the wealthy ago. So I'm very leery about this sacrifice rhetoric because it all depends on who it is demanded of.
Sacrifices is defined as usually the real or exaggerated burdens shouldered by some to implement policies that end up aggrandizing others. In the Ronald Reagan example from 1982, a national effort entailing sacrifices by the American people is now underway to make long overdue improvements in our military posture. Next call, Augusta, Maine.
Hi. Well, you more or less answered my question with your last quote. I was just curious as to why politicians, when the outcome of a war, be it Vietnam, a Gulf War, whatever, is good towards their political career, immediately claim credit instead of saying, oh, our service people did this, and if it's bad, it's somebody else's fault.
Shifting blame, of course, is a very tried and true political strategy, and there's a lot of language that goes along with it. What troubles me the most about language that's used by politicians to whip up war hysteria is that it's drained of the blood of people. It's drained of life. It's used as kind of a rhetorical, emotional technique. And meanwhile, people are suffering. And I would give you one example, which has been not reported very well in this press. In the year after the Gulf War, more than 150,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5 died as a result of the delayed effects of the U.S. air war on Iraq. That's not reported as an issue, and as a matter of fact, there are many quotes in my book using many buzzwords where politicians have claimed that we are ennobled by this glorious Gulf War. So that's an example of how, when there are lives being crushed, rhetoric is used to make that seem like a good activity.
Power brokers, sometimes reviled, but much more often consulted. Example, this has been a long and personal campaign, a humbling experience, reminding us that ultimate political influence rests not with the power brokers, but with the people. Jimmy Carter, 1976. Charleston, South Carolina, go ahead. Charleston, man. Yeah.
It seems to me that this book is a thinly veiled attempt to proselytize people to a certain political persuasion. For instance, I was wondering if the author here has any buzzword or defines the buzzword investment that Clinton is fond of using, which seems to mean more taxing and spending. And I was wondering just about that. Thank you.
Well, actually, tax and spend is in the book. You may know that the Democratic platform of 1992 denounces tax and spend. My book points out that tax and spend are two activities that any government has to engage in. I don't know if you, as a resident of North Carolina, chose to vote for Jesse Helms the last time out. My book does have many entries from Jesse Helms, and I certainly am proud that my book challenges the kind of bigotry against poor people, against black people, and against gays and lesbians, which Jesse Helms has engaged in. And so there's no problem there. I certainly am against that kind of bigoted attitude.
You've used the word rhetoric a little bit pejoratively. Winston Churchill was proud of being a rhetorician. Has the word changed its meaning?
I think the word has somewhat changed its meaning because of the usage of words. I think if you listen to Shakespeare being performed, there's something beautiful about language. If you read some of the John Kennedy speeches, they're very beautiful, but I'm at pains to point out in the book that you need to compare the music of the language and the alliteration of it and the emotion that it summons. All that has to be compared to the policies that are being implemented by the speaker or advocated by the speaker.
Sutter County, California. Go ahead.
Hi. I'd like you to comment on liberal and conservative, because they don't mean anything to me. And also, like the Republicans whining on the congressional floor all the time about being the minority party, whereas in fact in government nowadays they are the majority, having control over two branches, and just those kind of things that people take for granted all the time and don't make any sense at all anymore. And thank you for C-SPAN, and I'm going to run out and buy this book.
Okay, thanks. I'll point out before you answer that your entire entry for the word conservative is antonym, sort of, for liberal. And I'm going to look up liberal right now, so why don't you respond to...
Actually, I can tell you that's antonym, sort of, for conservative.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, these buzz phrases, liberal and conservative, are of decreasing value. They don't really define what a politician's positions are. They are labels that are shorthand. I don't think they're very useful. And I actually, as I remember, again, unless we had to cut it for space towards the end, we have a listing for labels. And politicians, here it's defined as concise and mostly negative tags pinned on politicians, usually by their foes. Well, politicians make a ritual of denouncing labels, but they never foreclose the option of engaging in the use of labels themselves. And if all else fails, if you don't like the labels thrown at you, you can accuse the other politician of being a compulsive labeler. But underneath the labels, we live in a society where people are still facing dramatically unequal opportunities because of their gender, race, and so forth, and that needs to be addressed.
Is there such a thing as a bleeding heart conservative?
Gee, I don't know. I haven't studied enough medicine to know whether hearts really bleed. Actually, there's a quote in the book, as I recall, from Geraldine Ferraro, where she goes out of her way to...
She says, "I am not a bleeding heart, a sob sister." Geraldine Ferraro, 1982.
And part of that, I think, is the political climate that has been whipped up that makes it seem bad to be compassionate. And, of course, politicians say they're compassionate, but it's a term and an approach to government that has been de-emphasized in recent years.
Jacksonville, Florida is on the air. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for the author, and that is, I've heard the term homophobia being used somewhere around the mid-'80s. It became popularized. And, you know, for so long, homosexual activity has not always been embraced in our society. Yet the term homophobia is a word that seems to represent almost an antagonistic approach toward those who object to homosexual activity. My concern, or my question really is homophobia a buzzword, or is it a legitimate word that is embraced by all psychiatrists or mental health practitioners who recognize it as a true phobia?
I can't speak for all psychologists or mental health professionals. The term homophobia has come up from the grassroots. It's come up from people who have worked very hard to challenge the kind of bigotry that has so long been oppressive to gay men and lesbians in the society. One of the finest moments, I think, of Bill Clinton's acceptance speech in Madison Square Garden was when he addressed this question of how Republicans especially, but also many Democrats, have tended to blame them for our problems. And as he pointed out, I think, in one of his very finest moments of this entire campaign, it's them, the liberals, them, the poor, them, the gays, and we need to get beyond that. That's true divisiveness, that's destructive, and it's also, I think, antithetical to the kind of society that needs to be built.
Blame America First crowd. Usage. When you're sick and tired of noisy criticisms aimed at government policies, stir this phrase into a cauldron of vilification. Example. What we cannot be proud of is the unshaven, shaggy-haired drug culture, poor excuses for Americans wearing their tiny, round, wire-rim glasses, a protester's symbol of the Blame America First crowd out in front of the White House burning the American flag. Congressman Gerald Solomon, January 1991. Next call, Abilene, Texas. You're on the air.
I wanted to know what you think of the new phrase that Clinton and Gore are kind of throwing around about taking back America, what you think that means and what kind of an audience that's aimed at.
Do you have any thought, caller?
I'm just curious what he thinks. I'm not really sure. It seems so vague, but it's real catchy, and I just wonder what he thinks about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is very catchy. You could almost dance to it. It has a rhythm. Take Back America. Jerry Brown used it a lot, of course, in the last 6 or 8 months. And it does have an appeal. I don't feel very good about that kind of sloganeering for many people in this country who are being told to take back America. It is absurd because they never had America. You know, if you talk to African American people, they will, with few exceptions, I believe, tell you that they have always in this country, and their ancestors have always been excluded from not only the corridors of power, but even a fair shake by any definition. Poor people have been excluded from this government, and we can see that in Washington all the time. So the idea that we're supposed to take back America when essentially we never had it, I think is kind of ahistorical, to put it mildly.
Another example, a couple obsolete terms. The red tide, he said that it's obsolete, referring to communism, I guess. And Reds, obsolete except in the Cincinnati area and among baseball fans generally.
Yeah, of course, there's a new term that's been coined by some politicians. They're not so into attacking Reds, but they're talking now about greenies. and the threat of greenies is apparently being posed by environmentalists.
Which brings us to the phrase printed on recycled paper. Usage. If constituents receiving your newsletters tend to be environmentalists or greenies, that's my ad, you may want to add, quote, with soy ink, unquote. Seattle is next. Go ahead. Seattle.
Yeah, this is a retired doctor who has been a Republican all of his life. I actually went to medical school between 33 and 37 and retired a few years ago when I became sort of burned out. At any rate, I had listened last week to an interview with Mr. Lamb regarding the elitists and the populists, and his observation that both were necessary for a functioning political society. And that's the principal thesis. There was no dole, there was no Social Security, and when I drove across country in 33 and 34, California was or bust was frequently seen on the roads. Things have changed a great deal, of course, within that time frame, but the responsibility of the federal government for anyone except the retirees of the military and a few things like that was absent. I've become disenchanted with the programs, many of which were started by President Roosevelt, and I haven't been at all happy about the last few years.
Or how would you put all that in the context of rhetoric, speech, political language?
Well, in that particular thing, it's a good question. It's a legitimate one. I'll have to think about it for just a moment.
Well, at the risk of seeming a little bit like a politician here, I'd like to grab a little thread of your question and pull on it. A lot of programs that have been implemented over the past decades to help people have been attacked as being part of a tax and spend syndrome, being attacked as socialistic. Of course, that was said about Social Security and then about Medicare and Medicaid. It's now being said about, for instance, daycare programs, new nutrition programs that have been suggested, for instance, are apt to be attacked as part of big government and so forth. But underneath that kind of rhetoric, which may appeal to some people about how we can't have tax and spend policies or socialistic policies, is the fact that there are millions of children in this country who lack adequate access to nutrition, to health care, to education. Their access to job training and opportunities are severely limited. And all of the hot air in the world and all of the alliterative phrases that tell us we shouldn't tax and spend do nothing for those children who will be the adults and citizens of this country when we reach the 21st century.
Do you have nattering nabobs of negativism in here?
You know, I tried to limit some of those Agnewisms. I have a few in here. Spiro Agnew, of course, was great at a lot of that rhetoric, and I think I threw some of those out and kept some of them in.
All right, we'll check it out. Next, Reston, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hello. I'd like to ask Mr. Solomon if he thinks that recent comments by Dan Quayle about the cultural elites, especially of New York, really are hidden references and derogatory ones at that to Jews.
Well, I think that Dan Quayle is walking in the footsteps of a former unqualified vice president, Spiro Agnew, who in 1969, in the autumn of that year, attacked the elites and the media elite, and attacked only those media elites that he opposed. In this case, Dan Quayle has several $100,000 invested in an Indiana newspaper chain, and he also is supported by, or his party has been supported by, many news outlets. And by the way, with the exception of Barry Goldwater in 1932, these so-called cultural elites that Quayle attacks have been overwhelmingly endorsing Republicans. Most of the daily newspaper endorsements since FDR, almost all except with Goldwater, were for Republicans. Now, about whether that's an attack on Jews, I don't really think so. I think it's more of an attack on media that are showing any kind of inclination to challenge the White House line.
Interesting, the phrase, "my fellow Americans," you call it a canned portion of instant warmth, just heat and serve. And that's probably a bipartisan usage, isn't it, among presidents?
Oh, definitely. A lot of this is bipartisan language. And of course, we have a lot of talk about family. And if you look up family in the book, there are many permutations of how politicians say that we are all part of the American family. Of course, that sounds very nice. It sounds very Ozzie and Harriet or Bill Cosby show-like. But what kind of family would allow some people every night to go up to the bedroom under cozy blankets and let other people sleep in cardboard boxes on street corners? We wouldn't have that kind of family arrangement and call it healthy, and yet this so-called American family is such that the rhetoric from politicians is providing a cover for that kind of inequality when it comes down to cases.
Clearwater, Florida is next.
Yes, in 1989, William Lutz produced a book called Doublespeak. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Right.
And in that book, he attacks the misuse of language and the obfuscation of meaning in areas as diverse as government, business, advertisers, etc. I was wondering if that particular publication had any influence on your book.
No, frankly, I intentionally did not read it until I finished the book because I didn't want to seem to duplicate it, and the same goes for Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary. But I have read since then some of Lutz's work. I think it's terrific. The words are really key. One example, and they are often institutionalized, the Defense Department. We don't have a Defense Department. We have a military department. We don't have a defense budget, $300 billion a year. It's military outlays. I say in parts of the book, and I've tried to say elsewhere, that when words are repeated endlessly, they become hollow, they lose their meaning, and they are tools for manipulation. The cliche is the frequent enemy of meaning. We have to get beyond the cliches and talk about the lives in the balance because of government policies.
Well, it used to be the War Department. Does the change to defense, would you think that was a good move?
I think it was a move that George Orwell would have understood very well. It's a way to put cosmetics on a corpse, and it's not only a matter of who's being killed at the other end of those weapons, but it's also a matter of what's being done to our society. Think what we could do with the kind of money that's being poured down that rat hole.
But in terms of the terminology, as among the three, military, defense, or war, to describe that department, which do you prefer?
Well, I prefer the military department because that's what it's all about.
Okay. La Crescenta, California, last call. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm troubled and confused by all the attacks on Hillary Clinton about her not wanting to stay home and bake cookies as against the traditional woman. Now, to my way of understanding, my friends, the traditional woman is out working. She has to work in order to make the budget. So why do they attack her as attacking the traditional woman? What is the traditional woman?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the problems, I think, with the family values rhetoric that we've gotten from the Quayle team. He's living in kind of a Norman Rockwell, Ozzie and Harriet kind of world. We know, partly for very positive reasons because of feminist movement activities in the last decades, and partly because of the economy, the picturesque or supposedly picturesque family where one person stays home and the other parent goes out to work and that's sufficient for income, that's not a real world portrait.